Good evening. On behalf of the Indiana University College of Arts and Sciences, thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Vanessa Clough, and I serve as the college's Director of Alumni Relations. Our Food for Thought live streaming series serves as an opportunity for alumni and friends to hear from faculty experts, explore topics of interest, and stay connected with the college and Indiana University, regardless of your location. I'm delighted to introduce tonight's featured presenter, Dr. Christian Matthes from the IU Department of Economics. Dr. Matthes is an associate professor of economics, and his research interests include monetary policy, fiscal policy, and statistical analysis of economic data. A native of Germany, Dr. Matthes worked in the research department at the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond before he joined the IU faculty in 2019. Following his presentation, Dr. Matthes will be joined by economics PhD student Ellie Cothran for the audience Q&A session. Ms. Cothran is an associate instructor for the Department of Economics, and her doctoral research focuses on environmental macroeconomics. You can submit your questions at any point during this evening's discussion. Simply click on the Q&A tab located in your webinar toolbar. Hover your mouse over the screen and your toolbar should appear. Now it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Matthes for his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. Thank you, Ellie, for all the help. And most of all, thank you all for taking your time to hear about the US economic outlook. What I want to do is I want to provide today a broad overview of where we are in the US economy in these highly unusual times that we're all living through. I want to emphasize here how our current very unique situation compares to previous historical episodes that many of us have lived through and that were unique in their own right. In particular, I want to focus on three topics, a fourth one if I have time. The first one will be labor markets. I will emphasize that to get an understanding of where we are in the with labor markets, where we stand in the US economy right now, it's going to be useful to look at various different aspects of labor markets in the US, some of which you might not be that familiar with. The second big point I'm going to cover is gross domestic product. That's just the value of all goods and services produced in the US economy, a measure of how well the US economy is doing. And we're going to see what effect the pandemic had on gross domestic product, on the US economy as a whole. Now, I think what you might be waiting for is the third bullet point, that's inflation. And I'm going to spend the majority of my time on thinking about inflation. Where are we right now? How have we gotten here? And where might we be going? The fourth point, and I might not have time for this, is a brief international comparison. Think about how the US economy right now lines up with other advanced economies. If I don't get to cover this, but you are interested, please, by all means, ask about it in the Q&A. I'll be happy to go over it if I don't have time in my initial presentation. I do want to highlight that if you look at the first bullet point, I am going to focus here on the entire United States. Now, it would certainly be very interesting and worthwhile to also look at the state of Indiana or the Midwest as a whole. But both in terms of time limitations that I have today, and also in general in terms of data limitations, I'm going to focus on the US as a whole. Now, my last point that I'll spend some time on is some thoughts on where we're headed. This will most likely be much less concrete than what you're hoping for, but I want to make the case that given the current situation, that's going to be the best I can offer to you. So let's get going with the first big topic tonight, labor market data. What I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to show you lots of plots, lots of figures of economic data and how economic data has evolved over time. And a lot of these figures will have similar patterns. So let me briefly talk about what you're looking at right now before I go into the nitty-gritty economic details. So I hope you can see my pointer. On the x-axis down here, you see the years. On the y-axis, you're going to see the variable of interest. In our case, it's going to be the unemployment rate. And then sometimes in some of my graphs, you're going to see gray bars. Those are going to be recessions in the United States as stated by the National Bureau of Economic Research, the standard source for this type of dating of business cycles. Okay. So probably the prevalent labor market statistic that we're all aware of, that we all read about when we open our newspaper, is the unemployment rate. This graph here shows the unemployment rate. Let me first actually tell you exactly what the unemployment rate measures, because this is going to turn out to be quite important and actually can be quite misleading. The unemployment rate tells us how many people are unemployed relative to those who are in the labor force. What does the labor force mean? The labor force is made up of people who are either employed or unemployed and looking for work, okay? So it is those people who are unemployed and looking for work relative to the total sum of people who are either working and looking for work. Why am I bringing this up? There are a lot of people out there, and we're going to come to that, it's going to be a topic tonight. There are a lot of people out there in the US economy right now who do not have a job, but are not looking for a job either. If you're not actively looking for a job, you are not going to be in this unemployment rate number. That is an important caveat to take into account when you study the unemployment rate. Now, we see that there's been a lot of fluctuation over time in this blue line, this unemployment rate. I want to highlight one pattern that's been prevalent throughout the post-World War II period, which is what this sample of data covers. Whenever there's a recession, meaning a severe and prolonged contraction in economic activity, we see a sudden increase in the unemployment rate, followed by a relatively slow decline. This might be most prevalent after the last recession before COVID, caused by the great financial crisis. We saw a sharp sudden increase and a slow but steady decline. Now let us compare this with where we are right now in the very right side here. This is the unemployment, this is recent unemployment data. During the COVID pandemic, there was a huge shot up in the unemployment rate. In fact, it's been the highest it has in the entire post-World War II period. But also note how another feature that makes this last recession, this COVID pandemic, so singular in terms of US economic history is the sharp decline in the unemployment rate that followed directly after. Very different from what we saw after the Great Recession and any other post-war US recession, okay? So there's something, so this recession, this pandemic was really special. Now, there is more going on in the labor market. And for that, I'm going to look at another statistic, namely quits. How many people have quit in the US economy? Now, be aware that this data has only been compiled for the last 20 years or so. So this data starts around 2000, okay? So this measures really how many people quit every month in the US economy. And we see, as you would expect, whenever there's a recession, remember gray bars are recessions, we see a decline in quits. Why? If there's a recession, the economy isn't doing so well, your outside options aren't so good, okay? So you're not as likely to quit your job. The same thing happened when the pandemic happened. But note what happened right after. Not only did quits shoot up, they actually shot up at a very fast, much faster than before, and to a level that we have not seen in the United States since 2000, when the Bureau of Labor Statistics actually started compiling this data. Now, are quits necessarily a good thing or a bad thing for the economy as a whole? I'm a macroeconomist, I study the economy as a whole. It's hard to say, right? Because you might quit because you have better opportunities elsewhere. We've all seen the help wanted signs posted everywhere in Bloomington, and I'm sure where you live. So maybe a lot of these people that quit, that contribute to this large increase in quits, maybe they've actually just found a better job. Okay, so that would be okay. However, if they quit and they actually leave the labor force, then we might run into problems. Why? There might be less people in the labor force. That means the economy as a whole, even if the unemployment rate is low, can produce less goods. So let's dig a little bit deeper and find out if there's anything to this narrative. So for that, I'm going to use yet another labor market statistic, the labor force participation rate. I have already introduced the labor force. Remember, the labor force is basically everybody in the US economy who either has a job or is actively looking for a job. And I'm going to compare that to the working age population, everybody who could, in theory, according to their age, be working. Now, it's actually kind of useful and interesting in its own right, and economists have spent a lot of time thinking about this, to look at some broad patterns here before I'm going to go to our current situation, which is the main focus tonight. We see labor force participation was low, around 50 to 60% in the 50s and 60s, then started increasing. That is really due to increased labor force participation of females, more females entering the labor market. That's what this increase here is. Then we see a pretty stable labor force participation until the mid-2000s, when a decline started happening, mainly due to demographic forces, aging of the society. This actually flattened out, partly because before the pandemic, the economy was doing very well, was running hot, so there was a strong incentive to keep working. Now, what happened after the pandemic? Labor force participation dropped. Note, in previous recessions, there wasn't a big drop in labor force participation. But again, the pandemic is unique. But here's, from a macroeconomist's perspective, a slightly troubling part. Labor force participation hasn't recovered. There are now less people in the labor force, meaning either working or looking for work, than before the pandemic. And obviously, we can all think of different narratives as to why that is. Unfortunately, some of these people passed away. Others might be caretakers, for mothers or fathers. Maybe their kids couldn't go to school, so they had to stay home. Or maybe government transfers played a role. Okay, if many of us were recipients of government transfers during the pandemic. That obviously plays a role. And it's going to be up to future research to actually disentangle these different roles, these different factors. These factors that can actually interact, they're not independent. These factors that can interact to figure out why the labor force participation rate has actually dropped and has remained lower since the pandemic. Now, again, why is this troubling from a macroeconomist perspective? If macroeconomists think about labor as being one input into the production of goods and services, right? You need people operating machines. Even high-tech companies like Tesla need somebody running their production lines. So if there are less people around producing things, that means the economy is somewhat limited in what it can produce. And if it can be produced, it might only be able to do so in a more costly fashion. Okay, that's going to lead us to our later discussion of inflation. Before I go to inflation, though, I want to spend one slide on gross domestic product, the value of goods and services produced in the US economy every quarter. This graph shows GDP. It does so in a very specific form. It's real per capita GDP. What does that mean? Real means I have taken out the effects of inflation, right? We're going to talk about inflation later. Here, I'm just going to talk about real goods. So every point on this line is comparable, no matter if it was 1960 or 2010. And then per capita, because I want to take out the effect of the number of people living in the US, population effects. Now, what do we see? We usually see a stagnation or a fall in this real GDP measure, the amount of goods produced and services produced in the economy when there's a recession. This is almost the definition of a recession. I want to highlight two things that are going to also contrast the two most recent, really severe economic downturns in the US. First, the Great Recession associated with the financial crisis. That's this line right here. We see a persistent fall in GDP, and it actually took a long time for the US to recover. And this is something that economists have tried to understand. We've tried to come up with economic models. I've done so myself, but many, many other people in the economics profession have done this too. Coming up with models, trying to understand why the US economy took such a long time to recover, when in previous recessions, the recovery was much swifter. But now let's confront what happened during the Great Recession with what happened during the pandemic. A very strong, stark fall in this GDP measure. Obviously, during the pandemic, less goods were produced, less services were produced, services being the main culprit here. But note how strong this recovery has been. And in fact, now we are actually back above, with the very latest GDP reading, we are back above in terms of real GDP where we were before the pandemic. So we do produce, broadly measured, the same amount of goods and services now than we did before the pandemic, but with less labor. We've already established that. We've looked at labor markets. Okay, so what gives if you produce the same things with less labor? Well, it's going to be more costly for the economy. That's where we're going next. Inflation. That's what I think we all want to talk about. This is really, right now, for better or worse, the most interesting thing going on in the US economy, because labor markets seem to be doing really well. We have recovered in terms of GDP, but inflation is not doing so well. And I'm going to show this here. This is the inflation rate. It measures how much prices have increased from one year to the next. There are various different measures of the inflation rate. I choose to use the personal consumption expenditures measure, not because it rolls off the tongue, but because that's what the Federal Reserve Board uses. The Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve System use this specific index of inflation to gauge inflation outcomes. And in fact, over the last decade or so, they have established an inflation target of around 2%. Okay. So what do we see? What's obviously striking, and some of you might remember this, that in the 1970s and 1980s, and early 1980s, mainly in the 70s, inflation was strikingly high. And there's been a lot of economic research about this, including by myself. I've actually written my dissertation on this topic. What happened in the 1970s and how was the Federal Reserve able to get this inflation under control? So to give you a little bit of historical context, because it's going to be relevant for the current situation, in the 70s, there were a lot of things going on in the economy, including oil price shocks. And those actually fed through the economy. The Federal Reserve didn't counteract inflation strongly enough, and that led to these big two spikes in inflation. And in the early 1980s, Paul Volcker became the chairman of the Federal Reserve, and he actually started fighting inflation. He really raised interest rates, and this did bring inflation down. So what I want to say here, the Federal Reserve has the tools to bring down inflation at any time. They know how to do it. However, this is not cost-free. By raising interest rates a lot, Paul Volcker brought down inflation, but there was a recession. You see this gray bar here? That is usually attributed to monetary policy, bringing inflation down, but causing an increase in unemployment. Now, after this, inflation stabilized and remained relatively low until the pandemic. In the pandemic, inflation has increased dramatically and is now well above the 2% target that the Federal Reserve has set for itself. Now, this number is slightly above 5%. You might have heard in the news a number that's closer to 7%. That is because that's a different measure of inflation, namely the CPI measure. Okay, both measures move together a lot, but their levels are a little bit different. Now, this gives us an overview of where we are with inflation right now, where inflation is at its highest level since the early 1980s. That's striking. There are many, many people living right now that have never experienced such high inflation rates. So the question is, how did we get here? So there are many, many different aspects that I could emphasize, but I want to highlight two. First, I want to talk about fiscal policy. And I recognize this graph that I'm showing you here is very busy. I apologize, but I think it makes a really important point. I've taken this out of a recent working paper by two well-known economists, George Hall and Tom Sargent. Tom Sargent in 2011 won the Nobel Prize. He's probably the preeminent living macroeconomist today. And what I want to focus on in this graph that has a lot of different information, I want to focus on this blue line, What does this blue line say? This blue line shows how much money the government spends. It's outlays that the government has, net of interest. Why net of interest? Because the government has debt. So every month, it has to actually spend some money to pay the interest on its debt. Let's take that out. Let's really just think about everything else the government spends, and let's measure that on the y-axis here as a percentage of GDP. So relative to the size of the economy at this time. These are time series that go back a long time, starting in 1900. So what do we see? We see big spikes after 3 events. Hence the title of this paper, 3 World Wars. World War I, World War II, and the war against COVID. Couple of things to note is that these spikes obviously fall again after these events, but they usually don't fall back to their original level, but there's somewhat of a ratchet effect, where some of that increase remains permanently locked in, both after World War I and after World War II. Note also that the Great Recession here, we see a similar effect, but it really is minuscule compared to the world wars and to COVID. This is the Great Recession. This is the increase. Remember, President Obama had a lot of programs trying to stimulate the economy. It was reasonably successful, but it cost money. We see here it increased. It went down, not to the previous level, but a slightly higher level. But this spike is much, much smaller than the one we see for COVID. So the government spent a lot of money. And in particular, one thing that I'm sure you're all aware of, the way the government spent money wasn't very targeted. A lot of people got stimulus payments, maybe some people that didn't really need them. So this is something that we're going to see here. So if you get a lot of stimulus, if you get stimulus payments from the government, but you might not really need it, what would you do? You would spend it. So these are retail. This is the growth rate of retail sales in the US economy. And we see it obviously dips in 2020. Well, because there were no shops open, basically. But then it increased a lot, and it stayed much, much higher. So retail sales have increased dramatically. This also partially reflects a shift away from services towards goods in the US economy. But still, that explains, if there's a lot of retail sales, a lot of people want to buy stuff, we've already established that there's less of a labor force to produce things. That might explain why prices have to increase, one factor. Related, we can look at consumer spending and income. Okay, so what does this plot show us? The red line shows us real disposable personal income. Basically, how much income do you have to spend? And you see, it's again in growth rates. And you see, during the pandemic, this actually increased a lot because the government gave a lot of money. It went down, well, then there were more payments. It has since stabilized at around 0 again, okay? So this effect has waned on income, but what about spending? This is the blue line. And we see spending, similar to retail sales, fell during the first part of the pandemic, but has since shot up and has remained elevated. So people spend a lot more again. So this is one aspect. Now I want to be clear. This is really only one aspect. There are other aspects, but one aspect is that people have a lot more income because the government spend a lot of money. That is not necessarily a bad thing. I don't want to make any judgment calls here. I just want to describe the facts. Now there's one other feature and one other aspect of the economy that you probably have heard of. Maybe if you were in the market to buy a car, or maybe if you or someone you know wanted to buy a computer or a video gaming system, well, some goods are really hard to come by. For example, semiconductors. There have been supply chain disruptions caused by the pandemic. And so what I show here is something that the Federal Reserve Bank of New York put together, an index for global supply chain pressure, okay? What does this mean? It takes a lot of different indicators about costs of shipping goods, about surveys of managers, a lot of different information. It puts it together to create one index that measures how much pressure there is on global supply chains. And we see since the pandemic, it's been at unprecedented levels. Okay, this series starts in 1997. There was when the pandemic first waned, there was a decline again, but then it has picked back up with Omicron and so on. And I want to also show you that other big events when it comes to supply chains really are orders of magnitude smaller than the pandemic. For example, in 2011, I don't know if you remember, there were big natural disasters in Asia. There was the Japanese earthquake. There was a big typhoon in Thailand that really disrupted global supply chains. We see that here, but it's a really small spike compared to what's going on with the pandemic. Similar, I think most of us are aware of trade issues during the last administration. We see that these caused some disruptions in global supply chains here, but again, much, much smaller than what's going on with the pandemic. So the pandemic, in terms of inflation, is almost this perfect storm of less people that can produce goods, people have more money, and there's another factor, supply chain disruptions, that also make it harder to actually get goods in people's hands, that make goods more expensive. So also this global, it's really, yeah. I mean, I hope we never see anything like this again. But now we're left with dealing with the effects, with the aftermath. Now let me actually see here what time it is. I think I'm basically at half an hour. I can start taking questions and maybe leave the international comparison for later if there are any questions. But before I do that, let me actually, because I promised you to actually conclude, let me actually do that. So where are we going forward? So the one thing I want to leave you with is, unfortunately, we're facing massive uncertainty. There's massive uncertainty going forward for the global economy. First, we don't know what will happen with COVID. We hope the worst is behind us, but we don't know that. There might be another strain coming. Furthermore, we don't know how governments will react to new developments in COVID. What do I mean by that? The US has decided not to have any more shutdowns, but other countries, for example, in Western Europe, have been much more strict. So it's not clear what will happen in other countries and how the US will behave going forward. Now, kind of a corollary to this is supply chain issues could also interact with government policies. China so far has basically followed a zero COVID strategy. That also means they're pretty vulnerable. They will shut down cities if there's COVID. Since we rely on China for the global supply chain, that makes us vulnerable to what the Chinese government will do in reaction to COVID. Now, when you think about specific forecasts, I want to say a couple of things. First, something that I always try to emphasize when I worked at the Federal Reserve. Whenever someone asks me for a forecast, I always tell them measures of uncertainty associated with that forecast. And every professional forecaster does that. We should pay attention to these measures of uncertainty. It makes a difference if we're very certain about the economy or very uncertain. Right now, we are so uncertain that any specific prediction makes little sense in my view. Nonetheless, I can tell you what other people think. There is a regular survey of professional forecasters now carried out by the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. And at the end of last year, the professional forecasters surveyed there, these are forecasters working for financial firms and other big companies. They expected inflation to fall again substantially, namely below 3% over the next year. I have to say that I am less optimistic. We might end up with 3%, And I think that would be fantastic. But I think there is substantial risk that inflation remains dramatically elevated relative to the Fed's 2% target. Okay, supply chain issues might still play a role. There's still a lot of unspent money, if you will, in the US economy. People have income left over that they want to spend. And that will eventually show up in inflation. And people are not back in the labor force. So all these factors that we have visited tonight, that we've seen tonight, leave me a little bit doubtful that we're really going below 3% over the next year. But I hope I'm wrong about it.
I'll try to start with the unemployment related questions and then on to the inflation related to sort of keep within the structure of the presentation. So one question is, do you think that the quits have anything to do with these huge amounts of money that the government has been putting into the economy over the last year or two?
So I don't have a definitive answer for that. I think that's where a lot of research in labor economics and macroeconomics has to come into play. My hypothesis is certainly that this must play somewhat of a role. Again, there are many other things related to the pandemic that can play into that, but these increased incomes will factor in there.
Again, with unemployment, so what do you think are some of the factors that led to this sharp decrease in unemployment that we see post-pandemic?
That's a great question. So I think a lot of people, so let me first put this in perspective. Just before the pandemic, we basically had the lowest unemployment rate since the 1950s. So a lot of people had jobs. And I think what happened is that after the initial pandemic, a lot of people went back to their jobs. And then on top of that, people actually left the labor force. So that also has an effect on the actual unemployment rate. So I think it's really, we started out from a great level in terms of the unemployment rate, and a lot of people went back to their jobs. And some people left the labor force completely. That means they're not counted in the unemployment rate anymore. Yeah, I think, I mean, that's at least as a first pass. I think that's how I would rationalize this pattern in the data.
So another unemployment related is, so is there any demographic information about the people that are leaving the labor force, based on age, sex, prior income levels, sort of socioeconomic status, race, urban versus rural, any demographic information at all?
I think that's something that economists are still collecting. And we're trying, one thing that has come out of the pandemic is the realization that there is a much bigger need for basically real-time economic data. A lot of this information of the type that the question was about is usually gathered in surveys. Surveys are unfortunately relatively slow moving, at least the traditional surveys that we in economics use. I think we have to do a lot better. I don't have these off the top of my head, but this is obviously crucial information for us to better understand what happened.
So how is it that people that have relied on their jobs to pay bills suddenly not need to work anymore and can leave the labor force? So businesses are begging for labor at higher wages than before, yet labor force participation seems to be remaining low. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, there are a couple of aspects to this. One is government transfers. At least when the pandemic began, basically there was the payments that were sent out by the government didn't really distinguish, actually due to technical reasons, because the system the government uses for payouts is very old. It's very old-fashioned. They couldn't basically change the computer programs. Unfortunately, that's the truth. They couldn't really change the numbers, so they basically gave almost everyone the same. And for a lot of people, the money they got was actually more than they made at their jobs. So there's a lot of evidence for that. So that's one thing. Another thing is that maybe these people had no choice. Think about, if you're a single parent and your kid no longer can go to school because the school shut down. So then you almost have no choice, even if you make less money. But again, I want to say these are kind of anecdotes that I'm saying here. This is something that economists are still actively thinking about. With economists, macroeconomists, labor economists, still actively collecting data, trying to understand what happened and how we can best help those people that actually need to help.
So says that the data appears to be from the US. So how would how would data from just Indiana compare?
So again, I don't know, but I think that's really a crucial question for us to answer going forward. And it gives me the opportunity, sorry, Margaret, for slightly abusing your question here. It gives me an opportunity to say something about kind of a misconception that people have. Sometimes in the news, in social media, you hear people say, well, economists are arguing for opening of businesses. No, if you ask economists, the broad consensus has always been, let's make sure we get the pandemic under control. That's the best way to help the economy, nothing else, okay? But going back to Margaret's question, I think spot on. Yes, super important to know these things. Unfortunately, I don't. I wish I did. And that's something economists will have to figure out.
So another question from just an anonymous question is, wouldn't the fact that baby boomers have reached retirement age play a part in this? So again, back to the demographics. So our efforts maybe to keep people from moving in more, maybe immigration policies combined with a large generation starting to age out of the labor force. Do you think this has a significant negative impact on the labor force?
Yeah, so that's definitely true in the long run. I think that's absolutely true. So one thing is, it's less clear if that played a role in this very discrete and sudden jump downwards in the labor force participation that I showed, that then didn't recover, right? Because it was a very sudden shift. Now, over the long run, absolutely. I think immigration is needed for the U.S. economy to maintain its course. Skilled immigration, mainly, especially. Now I'm biased. I am an immigrant, but I think that's how the U.S. economy has always grown, and that's, I think, if we want to go back to a path of persistent growth, I think that's a way forward. Absolutely.
And so I think this might be the last unemployment related question I see from Raj, who asked, do you think the US is training enough workers to fill the expanding technology needs? So if more labor is concentrated in more tech capital heavy areas, are we doing enough training?
There was, after the Great Recession in particular, there was a big discussion about this. It just went under the moniker of skills mismatch. Economists have thought a lot about this. Now, obviously, we need to prepare students at any level for the requirements that they will need over their lifetime, and that means a lot of technology. Now, and we also know we can retrain people. People can learn on the job, and this is something I think a lot of firms invest in. In the short run, I think we have a shortage for specific skills, but again, the U.S. has often faced a situation and managed with immigration, and immigration has actually, by a lot of measures, has been very helpful for the U.S. economy overall, also for natives.
So I am going to move on, I think, to some inflation related questions. One is, Christopher asks, what was the debt to GDP ratio in 1981 as opposed to today? Which I think you mentioned a little bit, but if you could expand on.
That's a great point. So thank you, Christopher, for bringing that up. It was much, much lower than today. So one thing I think where your question might be headed, I hope I'm not misinterpreting it, is an increase in interest rates now will be much, much more costly for the government than it was in 1980. That is absolutely true. That is a difficult situation. So you can bring down inflation, but it's going to cost the government, and that means ultimately it's going to cost us as citizens. So I'd be remiss, again, I'm going to kind of abuse a question, I'm sorry, but I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that these are the type of issues, these interplays between fiscal policy and monetary policy. These are types of issues that the economics department at Indiana is very, very well known for. My colleague Todd Walker, Eric Leeper, who's an emeritus here at the department, have been world leaders in thinking about these issues. These are now issues that are at the forefront of determining where the US economy is headed.
And Russ had a clarifying question about the inflation measurement. So he wanted to know, does the PCE measure include gasoline for vehicles and natural gas, fuel, oil for home heating, or is it not include energy expenditures?
That's a good point. I was not very clear on this. So the measure I showed includes them. The Federal Reserve tends to take this out. They call this core inflation. Why? Because prices for this core inflation measure basically takes out prices for food and gas, because these tend to be very volatile, and so not very informative about where the inflation rate is headed. Now, this is a double-edged sword, obviously, because we usually spend a lot of our money on gas and food, so we want to know how prices evolve there. But again, these prices change a lot from month to month, quarter to quarter, year to year.
Michael had a question about a digital dollar. So, if you had any thoughts on the Fed issuing a digital dollar, a digital currency, and why would they consider that, or if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, so this is obviously a very relevant question, right? So why? So there are a couple of different. So first, I want to say I'm not an expert on this, but so one is there are digital currencies out there. Bitcoin, it's probably the most prominent one. They can facilitate trading. They can be useful for they can facilitate trading, especially because they can be faster to transfer. We all know how painful it is to transfer money from one bank account in the US to another. Moving Bitcoin around is much faster. So that might be a hope. In the end, I'm not an expert. I think some of these advances will ultimately show up in the US dollar, in the payment system in the United States. I'm doubtful that we will move to a fully digital currency. But it is true that cash in general plays less and less of a role. We already see this in other advanced economies that are further along here than the US, where basically cash plays no role at all.
And so there's another question from Christopher, who wants to know, rather than forecast inflation for next year, what do you think are the deflationary pressures that we might see push inflation down over the next year?
Well, so a couple of things can push inflation down. One is easing of supply chain issues. That can help. A lot of, for example, one big price increase was in cars, partly used cars, because there were not a lot of new cars on the market because they didn't have chips for them. They have a lot of computers in them now. So if that supply chain issue is fixed, then that would help. Second, transfers of the government, which I think, hopefully I've tried to convince you that this might be one culprit for the increase in inflation. Again, not overall a bad thing, it's just that we have to live with the associated inflation. I think that has eased. And then most importantly, I think the Federal Reserve will start increasing interest rates. So I think that's going to be the main force.
Rich wants to know, is the current high level of uncertainty going to result in a greater chance for a serious stock market crash, like potentially of the same magnitude that we saw at the onset of the Great Depression in 1929?
I don't think so. Stock markets do react to uncertainty, and we have seen this. If you only over the last 2 weeks followed the stock market, you saw that there have been big movements. But compared to movements over the last 2 years, these were still small potatoes. So I think there can be certainly big swings in the stock market, but nothing like a big crash. The U.S. economy overall is reasonably healthy in the short run, and that will be reflected by the stock market, at least in my impression. Again, we don't know exactly what will happen. There's obviously worst case scenarios that could play out, but my best prediction would be no, that nothing super bad will happen to the stock market. We might not see big gains, that could be, but no big falls.
So Ruli would like to know that you mentioned that you're less optimistic about inflation because of supply chain issues. So how would you envision the supply chain would ease in the future?
Well, I think it is one, I would hope, I'm optimistic that one of the key supply chain issues that I mentioned before is semiconductors, computer chips. I think there a lot of companies have been hard at work to make sure these supply chains become more robust. So I think that's going to be a key feature of going forward. I'm hoping that, as long as there are no big disruptions due to COVID in China, that problems there will ease up. And I hope also US policy changes, because part of supply chain disruptions were also big tariffs. And for example, just today, I think tariff on Canadian timber was reduced by the Biden administration. So these types of things I think are going to be really helpful to facilitate trade. And that's what we need. That's what's going to help supply chain issues.
And then Craig would like to know if you have any concerns about housing price escalations, possibility of another housing bubble.
So housing prices have obviously increased a lot. I say this as somebody who bought a house last year, and so I can tell you that has been true in Bloomington for sure, but also around the U.S. My hunch is that the economy will cool somewhat because the Federal Reserve will raise interest rates, and that tends to have a dampening effect on house prices. But now it's obviously a lot of factors come into play here. But everything else equal, I think the Federal Reserve's actions, which it already signaled for this year, will help to dampen these house price increases.
I had a somewhat related anonymous question, which is, do you see any similarities between the 1973-74 era shortages and high energy prices compared to now? Because this caused the 10 years sort of lackluster growth. So compared to that.
So as I said before, so that's what I wrote my dissertation about. So it's a topic that's near dear to my heart. So I think what I have a lot of faith in is that the Federal Reserve now knows a lot more than it did back then. It knows how to end these recessions. It knows how to end these inflations, maybe at the cost of a recession, but it knows how to end them. Because if not, then certainly we could see inflation spiral out of control. But I am very confident that there are a lot of very capable people at the Federal Reserve that will not let this happen, because inflation is very costly.
So another, since we are talking about your dissertation, another anonymous question would be, what's your background? If you could share a little more about your background.
Yeah, absolutely. So as I said, I'm an immigrant. I grew up in Germany, did my undergrad degree there, and then I came to the US to do my PhD at New York University under the supervision of Tom Sargent, whose paper I mentioned earlier. And then I've been around a lot. So my first job after graduating with my PhD was as an assistant professor in Barcelona, which was one of the top economics departments in Europe. So that was a great time for me. I learned a lot from really top people in the economics profession. And then I went back to the US. I worked at the Federal Reserve Bank in Richmond. So I gained a lot of experience there about what was very interesting was we could really see economic research being applied to really tackle important issues. I went to Richmond, I went to join the Federal Reserve System in the aftermath of the financial crisis. So we really grappled with issues that in the US we had never grappled with before, such as, huge amounts of assets owned by the Federal Reserve, much more than ever before, less than now, but much more than at any time before then. Issues such as the zero lower bound on interest rates. So in general, economists think that nominal interest rates, which the Federal Reserve controls and uses as a policy instrument, cannot go much below zero. And we were basically at zero at the time. So that opened up a whole new world where economists, both within the Federal Reserve System and in academia, had to think about how does the economy work in that situation. So intellectually, that was a fascinating time. And then 2019, as was mentioned before, I came to IU. Yeah, that's kind of my background in a nutshell.
So I had one more anonymous question that I appreciate much, considering my area of research. So this person would like to know if the fight against climate change and simultaneously, the effects of climate change itself, how do these contribute to higher inflation, if they contribute at all?
That's a great question. So I've done research with actually a colleague of Ali's, another great PhD student at IU, Hee-Soo Kim, and a former colleague of mine from the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond, Tuan Phan. And we actually looked at how extreme weather events what kind of impact they have on many variables, including inflation. And we actually show that, in the last decades, these are really so when there was an extreme weather event, that's actually caused increases in inflation, especially in food and energy prices. Maybe not surprisingly so, but it's good to quantify that. So yeah, going forward, as these extreme weather events become more recurrent, our statistical model will predict that, yeah, this will increase inflation, everything else equal. So this is something we have to take into account. It's something the Federal Reserve has to take into account. But I can tell you that this is something that central banks around the world, including the Federal Reserve System, take very seriously, and something that they want to study. So yeah, great question. So it could be very relevant in the future.
Monetary policy question. So Zach would like to know, how would the Federal Reserve stimulate the economy in a situation where interest rates are already so near zero? So anything beyond quantitative easing we saw at the onset of the pandemic.
Great question. So let me think. Let's think about what the Federal Reserve actually wants to do. The Federal Reserve actually wants to it influences a short-term interest rate, a very short-term interest rate which banks can borrow. But what it wants to do is it really wants to influence interest rates all over the US economy. The interest rate you pay on your mortgage, the interest rate you pay on your car. And so when we are at the zero lower bound, as Zach rightfully said, the interest rate, the short-term interest rate can't move down anymore. So then the Federal Reserve could do quantitative easing, could buy other assets to influence interest rates. It can do it does something called forward guidance as well, where it basically commits to future actions, saying we're going to keep the interest rate low in the future. But what will that do? You might say, first of all, that cannot matter. Well, but it's going to matter because it's going to give signals to the markets about what long-term interest rates will be, interest rates further out into the future, and that can have a strong effect as well, or at least a meaningful effect. So there are other tools available to the Federal Reserve when it hits the zero lower bound, but certainly we don't want to be at the zero lower bound. Now, given the current situation, I think we're actually going in the opposite. We're actually going to see an increase in interest rates, so we're going to at least temporarily move away from the zero lower bound. Now, a lot of people, both within the Federal Reserve System and economists in academia, think that in the long run, we're going to be pretty near the zero lower bound. So it's really going to be useful to think more about these issues and alternative policy instruments.
Thank you for all the questions. Again, sorry I couldn't get to every single question, but it's good to see so much interest in the topics. So I'll hand it back over to you, Vanessa.
Thank you again for joining us and participating in this evening's live stream. I would like to thank Dr. Matthes and Ms. Cothran for their time and expertise. We are grateful to you all. I would like to thank the IU Alumni Association and its members for assisting with tonight's program. Finally, I should acknowledge that events like this would not be possible without the support of donors who understand the value of a liberal arts education. If you would like to support the faculty, students, and programs of the College of Arts and Sciences, please consider making a contribution to the Arts and Sciences Priority Fund at the Indiana University Foundation. Until next time, please take care and stay safe.